tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We've seen more and more parents fundamentally deciding they do not want their children to be in public schools. This was the subject of a new report from my friend Paige MacPherson from the Fraser Institute. She is the Associate Director of Educational Policy there. Paige, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
So what did your study show?
So what we found when we look at the numbers in Nova Scotia in particular, and really it's not unique to Nova Scotia, it really is more of a national trend. We see a greater proportion of students going to independent schools in Nova Scotia. And why that is noteworthy is that there really is no what they call school choice, or what we would refer to as school choice here in Nova Scotia, which basically means that there's not tax dollars, parents' tax dollars don't follow their children to the school of their choice the way that they do in half of the provinces in Canada. So every province outside of Ontario and Atlantic Canada has that kind of a policy in place. In Nova Scotia, we don't have that. So what that means is that it's a more significant financial sacrifice for families to send their children to an independent school instead of attending their local government public school. And yet we see increasing enrollment to these schools here in Nova Scotia.
Now, when you say independent school, I know it's a broad category, but are we talking predominantly about religious private schools? Are we talking about schools that just have a different approach to education, or just the sort of conventional uniformed private school like an Upper Canada college that people have in their minds? Or what's the breakdown in Nova Scotia?
It really incorporates all of those types of schools. So we did a paper looking at the breakdown of the different types of independent schools across Canada, and it really is a diverse landscape of independent schools that exist across Canada. I think that, as you say, the kind of stereotypical image that pops into people's heads is that kind of uniformed prep school, but that really is not the majority. It's actually quite the minority of the independent schools, in other words, private schools in Canada. And so here in Nova Scotia, same as in every province, it includes some religious private schools or cultural private schools. So families who are seeking that option for a cultural or religious focus. It includes alternative education schools. So that might be a Waldorf school, a Montessori school, a progressive arts school, could include anything like that, a STEM school. And it also includes those elite prep schools, although that is not the majority of what the independent school landscape looks like really right across the country.
I know, you were on a panel we did on this topic more broadly a couple of months back on this program. And one of the things that came up was that the socioeconomic class, if you will, of parents that make this choice is not what a lot of people assume. It's not only the wealthy that are doing this, which when you bring up the point you raised earlier about how the money doesn't follow the schools, we're talking about parents making a big sacrifice here, which means it must really mean something to them to do it.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's lots of families who are just, not buying a second vehicle, not going on vacation, not doing any number of things so that they can make those sacrifices for their children to send them to an independent school. It's the same for families that homeschool, which often involves, one family member sacrificing an income, one parent staying home, at least for most of the time with the child or children. And so it is a financial sacrifice for these families. And what our data shows, I don't have Nova Scotia specific numbers, but I was just looking at the numbers on this in British Columbia as an example. And if you take out, so in British Columbia, as an example, those elite private schools that we were talking about are about 5%, just over 5% of the independent schools in the province. So a very small minority of those schools. When you take those out of the picture, the income gap between families that send their kids to government public schools and families that send their kids to an independent school is only 1.9%. So a very, very small gap in income between those government public school families and independent school families. When you throw those elite private schools back into the mix, the gap is 14%. So it's still not a dramatic gap, but if you take those out, which I think gives a more fair kind of look at the picture, only 1.9%. So we're not looking at the sort of stereotypical picture that sometimes pops into people's heads about independent schools in Canada. What we really see is that it's a lot of families that for one reason or another are seeking an alternative form of education for their kids. It could be something related to the philosophy or the educational approach of the school, as we just talked about, but it could also be something like, my kid has experienced bullying. in their classroom at their local government public school. There's too much violence in my local government public school. Whatever it might be, there's a number of reasons that families are seeking these alternative options. And it doesn't really fit that typical stereotype. And there's often the argument that comes up from critics of programs like school choice programs that they talked about off the top, where some of parents' tax dollars follows their child to the school of their choice, enabling more lower and middle class families to send their kids to the school that better fits them, to send their kids to an independent school or homeschool, or in Alberta's case, a charter school. And part of that criticism that people will say is that, well, you're taking money away from government public schools. But the reality is that these policies actually save taxpayer dollars at the end of the day. But they also, the reality is also, and certainly here in Nova Scotia, where we're looking at an increasing number of families sending their kids to independent schools, we're already funneling more and more money into government public schools year after year after year. Actually, Nova Scotia saw the second largest increase in funding to government public schools over the time period in our latest study, which was I believe 2012 to the most recent year, 2022. So that we are seeing this really large growth in spending in government public schools. So one of those criticisms is, well, we could take that money and we could improve things in government public schools. They're already getting money. Throwing more money at the problem, which is already happening, is obviously not solving the problem. So there is a lot that we could do to improve our government public schools for sure. But these programs that enable lower and middle class children to attend independent schools for those families, as we mentioned, that are making sacrifices, are really not the appropriate target here.
Just to broaden this out for a moment, Paige, is the rise in Nova Scotia, I mean, obviously I know this study looks at Nova Scotia, but from data you've seen elsewhere, is Nova Scotia a unique example, or is this really a more national trend, with the exception of perhaps Alberta, which I know does offer parents a fair bit more choice?
So in terms of enrollment patterns, no, this is not at all unique to Nova Scotia. Every single province in the country recorded growth in the enrollment to independent schools as a share of the student population. And the other thing is homeschooling. That's also going up right across the country. So our study looked at 2001 to 2019-20. And so it's a broad kind of look there. And we see that, again, in every single province, there is a greater share of students that are now attending independent schools, growth in that enrollment, and a greater share of students that are homeschooling, growth in that enrollment as well. Homeschooling is a very small proportion of kids overall in Canada that are making that choice for their family, but it is also growing. So really the takeaway here is that more and more families, despite in half the country it being very financially difficult, because in Ontario, in Nova Scotia, and across Atlantic Canada, there's absolutely no financial support for those families. They're paying their tax dollars to government public schools, and none of those tax dollars are following their child to the school that they're actually choosing for them. And yet they are still making that choice. They're still making the financial sacrifice involved. And so basically a greater share of families are just seeking alternative education for their kids. But it's not only good news for those families, because research shows that actually having these kinds of school choice policies in place, which enable more children to find the schools that are the best fit for them, actually improves results right across the board. So one of the takeaways for Nova Scotia, for example, or a province like Ontario, might be that enabling even more families to make these choices would be a good idea, because not only does research show an increase in student achievement in student tests, but it also shows reduced absences, reduced suspensions, just better results across the board, not only in those independent schools that families are choosing, but actually in the government public schools as well. Because a rising tide lifts all boats, right? The competition is good, and really that's what is borne out in the research. So if provinces like Nova Scotia, like Ontario, are looking to increase the diversity in their education systems, these kinds of school choice policies where the money follows the student are a really great place to start.
Well, and just, I mean, one glaring thing that comes up from a policy perspective is that you'd think, in theory, public schools would be improving as students leave, because they're still getting the same amount of money but having to serve a fewer amount of students. But that's not happening. So the issue is not a funding one, which is, I think, what we often hear from a lot of advocates. Well, we need to better fund public schools.
Yeah, I also just want to be clear about something. It's not that they're doing the sort of the old refrain that, oh, we have to do more with less. They're actually getting just more overall. And that accounts for enrollment growth, and that accounts for inflation. So per student, inflation adjusted spending in government public schools is up across the board. The only two provinces where that is not the case, where per student, so overall spending increased, but per student inflation adjusted spending in Saskatchewan and Alberta has decreased. In every other province, and certainly nationally, when you look at the average, has increased. So even if there are students that are leaving, going to other options, we're still pouring more money into the government public school system on a per student basis. There's still more money going in. So more money really isn't solving the problem. There's not been a year where, okay, we're seeing large decreases, and that can account for the flaws that we're seeing in the government public school system. I think there's other issues that we should be looking at, whether it's that we've moved away from the kind of content-rich curricula in our public schools, where we give kids that solid foundation of fact-based learning that makes it easier for them to then have critical thinking and comprehension skills later. We've moved away from phonics in our reading programs, for example. A lot of the policies have made it more difficult for teachers to actually have leadership and empowerment over their classrooms. And so we do see this increase in bullying and classroom violence. And there's big challenges for sure that we're facing in our government public school systems. More money is not solving the problem. So perhaps we should be looking at, the bigger issues here that are at play.
Well, you can read Paige's latest on this at the Fraser Institute website. More Nova Scotia families choosing independent schools despite lack of government support. Paige MacPherson, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.